Okay, and welcome everybody. So first we're going to start with a brief introduction, and then I'm going to go ahead and take us through our agenda. So let's go. All right, so to start, I think I've spoken with a good amount of you already, but I don't know, you might have seen my bio. Want to give a general kind of background on me. Why am I an authority on college essays? So here's my background. So um, I went to Vanderbilt University. I was an English major, always have been a writer. I wrote for my school newspaper. Um, Big background in creative writing. This was something that I was always passionate about, like very much a creative background as well. So an arts background too. Um, in general, I studied English literature, and then I studied art, like painting at Vanderbilt. Very lucrative, obviously, but it was a great experience. Obviously, I think it's one of those things where just in this current atmosphere, I can really speak to the value of liberal arts education. I think it has honestly provided me the skill set to be a really great eye when it comes to someone telling their own story and putting it in front of somebody else, especially in a specific situation. Um, I actually began my career, I kind of fell into it, as one sort of does right out of college. I had applied to a travel grant for art, to go overseas, and create a body of work. I didn't get the grant, and ultimately I ended up finding through my college's basically career board this job opportunity in China where I was able to work with 15 students per year for 2 years on just their essays for college applications. So top 20 schools, like really, really important, kind of nailing down the narrative, knowing what topics stick out. It was just absolutely trial by fire, like full crazy hours, obviously, during, the busy season of early decision or regular decision. But I just fell in love with, supporting students and in learning how to tell their stories. I think that the stories we tell ourselves as people in general are really powerful, including also the stories we tell others about ourselves. And this is kind of the first time in your life when you're a student applying to college that you're asked to figure out what your story is. It's a great opportunity, and I think it's often a really good opportunity for a student to be able to look at everything that they've achieved, look at their values, look at who they are, and get a clearer sense of self and also develop a lot of confidence. So that was what I really like fell in love with. I also found that I learned a lot from students. Listen, I told you, art and English major, so math was not necessarily my strong suit, but talking to students and learning from students who are really skilled at math and engineering and all these things that I was not as good at, I think really also helped me work with students and kind of learn how to empower themselves by talking about their passions. Well, I also learned in the process because I love learning, so it was just an excellent overall opportunity for me. So since then, I have essentially been doing this ever since then, managing a caseload of students privately. Um, my students have gotten into a bunch of the top 20 schools, including Cornell, Dartmouth, Purdue, some Vanderbilts. Vanderbilt, I would never get it now. It's quite competitive. Um, but it's been really wonderful. And it's so great to see a student really land where they're supposed to be. So I support students through the process, like from the beginning of the process, like selecting a college list, all the way through writing essays and then ultimately landing. Um, I also, just because the personal statement is all about being personal, I'll give you a little bit of personal detail about myself, which is I am currently in my studio in Brooklyn. I'm a painter, and I have an adorable one-eyed cat named Sammy, who you will find here. The tongue is not permanently out, but it is just one. It's just one of those pictures that just makes me laugh. So, I hope everyone. I hope we have some time. Also, okay, it's okay. So let's get into the agenda. So I need to do a little bit of table setting before we get to kind of the fun stuff of the essays themselves, because we want to understand the big picture of the context in which our essays are being, right? So we're going to go over a little bit, like really quickly, just the process of how an application is evaluated, especially in the arena of selective admissions. That's kind of the area that we are working in. So any school, I'll kind of set the scope of what counts as selective admissions in a sec. We're going to talk a lot about the personal statement. We're going to talk about the other common essay topics with breaking down kind of how to do those with some examples. We will talk about how to have an efficient process in developing all of your essays across the board. There's a bit of an art to that. And then we will go through a couple case studies. It's going to be really important, obviously, for us to view examples. Now, keep in mind, these examples are not meant to intimidate you or make you think you have to write, the great American short story or, anything like that. But it's really important to kind of see what these successful essays look like because they're really different than any bit of writing you've done. If you've thought about or looked at other essays, college essays, like personal statements, you probably have a sense of that, right? It's not like a traditional kind of sandwich style essay where you have an opening and a thesis and a closing, right? So it's its own art, and we'll talk about what that looks like. Okay, first I'm going to start with this quote. So this is from the former Stanford admissions officer. I always like this quote as kind of setting the scene. So we were all adolescents at one point, and there's an emphasis on being quote unquote normal, but I'm liking the way that students more frequently now are willing to be weird and willing to be themselves a lot more. Colleges are definitely looking for that. He says admissions counselors are human, and if 100 kids say the same thing, we can get a little tired of mundane stories. And so we're looking for stories that are going to be distinctive. So over and over, I'm going to say this so much tonight, but over and over, it's all about leaning into your individuality, leaning into what makes you different. There are some things that you like we'll talk about that might be counterintuitive in terms of what you want to write about, and we'll make sure we kind of distill that for you. So let's talk a little bit about selective admissions. So just kind of setting the scene here, we've got probably in terms of four-year institutions in the US, right? Four-year undergraduate programs, about 2,000, right? And then we have this kind of whole different ball game, which are the selective schools. At Testive and most advisories, you're going to see that selective schools are categorized as having an acceptance rate of 25% or lower. Sometimes that's 30% or lower. I mean, right now I'm being a little more conservative with how I kind of view like how I view overall acceptance selectivities just because of kind of the environment right now. So 30% might even be better. So we're looking at the top 50 to 100 schools out of 2,000, right? A really small percentage. But what they look for is very specific. And we're going to talk about kind of the selection process, the evaluation process that those schools go through. It tends to be pretty similar top down, but it's going to be much more selective and kind of stringent when you're talking like, top 20 schools, right? So, um, I'm going to start with a little history lesson, which is that in 2018, Harvard University was actually deposed in a Supreme Court case. It was actually sued by a couple of students who believed that they were being discriminated against. They were Asian American students, and they felt like their profiles really fit. And they thought that they felt they were super qualified. And they all were denied acceptance. So, basically, as a part of that, that got elevated to the Supreme Court. And for the very first time, literally in the history of college admissions, um, Harvard had to release their evaluation process. Before that, no school ever like had any incentive to be transparent about what that looked like. They always called it a holistic process, which is like, what does that even mean? Um, like looking at the whole student, but obviously there had to be some kind of system. This was our first look into the system. Um, and so Harvard's a really good standard. A lot of other top 20 schools, top 40 schools have actually confirmed that their system might look a little bit different than Harvard's, but it's similar, right? So we can take a lot from this. I think it's important that we, you know, can apply like some kind of wisdom or system, right, to this process that is otherwise pretty obscure. So Harvard does things a little interestingly. I think that I'm going to blow through this pretty quickly, but in general, they're looking at four different categories when they're evaluating a student's profile. So they look at the academic component, obviously, makes sense. The extracurricular component, what do they do with their time outside of school? There's a personal score, which is very interesting, and that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today. And then there's an athletic score, which is, also probably might surprise a few of you. Um, this is not to say that these are all equally weighted, right? Because if someone's just not an athlete, they're not going to get the lowest score, and that's not going to deny their admissions. It's more just like, is this person a recruited athlete? Because that's an important factor, especially for Harvard. So really what we want to be looking at is academic, extracurricular, and personal. So I want to talk first about academics because that is going to be kind of your cost of entry. Like that's the way that you're going to be even considered as a candidate for a school that is on your list, right? So most important across the board with any college is going to be your GPA, your class rank, and your course rigor, right? So you in general are going to be evaluated more against your own classmates and your own region than nationally, right? Which is why it's really important not to look at necessarily national averages for like SAT or GPA for your school. It's important to look at your school's region, like focus data, which usually they will have, right, through Naviance or Score. You all might have had those meetings already. Um, and feel free, I haven't mentioned this yet, but please feel free to ask any questions that you might have in the chat. I'll definitely address them as I go. Um, Course rigor is also incredibly important, right? Straight A's, but with, fewer APs, right? Or even APs with unreported scores. Those are all factors. So in general, a college wants to find basically someone who's in the top 25% of, their GPA, their projected GPA, their test scores, right? You want to kind of try to overshoot that. Um, Now, it used to be kind of assumed, okay, valedictorian, you're an Ivy League kid, right? That's a little different nowadays, basically because essentially of a couple of things, but one big thing is absolutely grade inflation. So some schools now have multiple valedictorians, and so what we're looking at now is we've got 40,000 about US valedictorians, right? That's just the US, not even internationally. And then freshman seats, 15,000 in all of the Ivy League. That's just, eight schools, but um these seats don't expand over time, and the amount of qualified students is expanding every single year. So, in general, how I think of academics is this is how you qualify. This is how you get through the first screening. This is how your application goes from, that first look to the next round. And then when it comes to the next round, they're going to say, okay, what else you got? Right? They also will look at extracurriculars. So, obviously, I think extracurriculars and personal, there's sort of an overlap on the Venn diagram here because obviously how you spend your time is clearly what you value, and what's personally important to you. All of these descriptions, by the way, that I have, these are from Harvard. So remember, like a Harvard might say, "Oh, you like a national or international award-winning, business owner or someone who's making like 150 million a year," and that might be Harvard standard, but it really depends on the school, right? Like that standard might look a little bit different for a school that's more in the top 40 or 50. Um, in general, as a rule, like strong leadership, evidence of leadership in your school is going to be super important, and some kind of passion that is demonstrated that you actually pursue it in a really sustained effort that kind of climaxes your junior year, senior year. That's a general good rule, right? Most importantly, you want to really actually genuinely care about what you're doing. Admissions officers are super good at reading through what looks like perfunctory, and just kind of resume padding. So it all needs to come from like this personal seed of interest or a personal story. Um, that's incredibly important when it comes to selecting extracurriculars. But in general, like a top score for an extracurricular student, think like top 10%, right, of applicants. That's what puts you at, that kind of highest score of one. And then we're going to get to what we are talking about tonight, which is the personal score. Now I have actually sifted through like this Harvard deposition. This is like thousands of like hundreds, thousands of pages of content. I ended up actually reading through the personal score because it was of great interest to me, obviously, in my line of work. So, in general, I found a lot of really interesting things there. One of the things that were written pretty consistently, you could actually look into students' admissions files and what admissions officers would write. They would ask questions like, what kind of roommate is this person? How will they be on campus, right? And that's actually very different than you might kind of imagine, as opposed to this quote, right? Which is like, oh, an outstanding person. This person's going to like move mountains in society. No, it's actually a lot more simple than that and more distilled than that. Are they going to be a positive presence who makes contributions on campus? Are they a nice person? Are they funny? What are their personal qualities? Is that like the type of student that we want? And here's obviously where we kind of have a bit of an obstacle, right? You might have you might have never met some of these admissions officers that are evaluating your application, right? So how are they going to give you a personal score if you haven't met them, you haven't talked to them, or maybe you've talked to them a little, like via email? Um, this is where you can actually display your, kind of your personality, right? It's in these softer factors of the application, and that is why essays are so incredibly important these days because like I said, you have so many high achieving students in especially academics. Um, it's incredibly important that like this is kind of where the applications are really like you kind of make or break your results when it comes to your personal score, especially if you're being viewed alongside some really competitive applicants. So essays is going to be the number one thing. That's why essays are so incredibly important. We also have recommendations, which are incredibly important as well. Um, Seeing a recommendation, like you can also tell if you've read enough when a recommender is incredibly enthusiastic and effusive about a student, or if they're writing a recommendation letter and it's kind of standard, right? Um, Recommendations from guidance counselors can speak to the student's development over 4 years, which is incredibly important, can speak to obstacles they've overcome that are academic. And so I would think about like one thing when I'm thinking about the personal statement is, okay, I already have somebody who is going to, in my application, be speaking to my high school experience and my experience as a student and person, like within the school campus, right? So one thing that it's really important to think about is how are we using our space? And if I'm thinking about, okay, I'm writing my personal statement, maybe your first instinct is to write about like an obstacle you faced in school, but it's important to remember, oh, like my guidance counselor is going to be writing about that, or my teacher is going to be writing about that. So maybe I should think about something else. This is why it's important to think about all the pieces of the application and how they go together rather than just kind of piecemeal working through it, right? And repetition doesn't really favor you when it comes to an application in general. You have limited space, so you want to use every space that you have or every component of the application to say something new about you, because that's what students are learning to do. Like I said, extracurriculars speak to the personal score as well. So that's obviously, like a display of what you value and care about. And there's family and geographic background. Like, are you a first gen? Are you like, did your family move from another country? All of these things kind of make up like, who is this person that's going to be on our campus, right? Um, I think often you can run into the trap of, okay, I've really, really pushed myself so hard academically. I've been like a stress ball all 4 years of school, and I just like didn't build in time to make, to have personal hobbies or to kind of like learn what I really like. It's all about making myself more appealing to colleges, and that's when you kind of run into an issue. Because then it's like, what am I going to write about, right? Now, everyone I've found always has something to write about. Like I said, the stories we tell ourselves are super important, and often the story that I get from a student when I first meet with them is like, I don't have anything to write about. Like nothing's happened in my life that's cool or important, and I can guarantee that that is not true. There's always something cool to write about. Um, so like I said, the personal score is incredibly important. We obviously like here's kind of what Harvard says, but yeah, consistently through recommendations, through essays, right? Um, and a rec letter that's like really really effusive saying that's the best student I've ever worked with, or this is one of the top 5% of students that I've had in like my career. Like they actually ask those things on recommendation letters. So just a little note, like definitely building that relationship with your teacher and your guidance counselor is super important as well. Additionally, like one thing that probably that kind of can affect your personal score is just tone, right? So if your application reads overall negative or dry, that will also impact your personal score. I'm gonna breeze over athletics. Essentially, for Harvard, and this is kind of its own specific thing, but if you're an athletics one for Harvard, you're gonna be recruited to play the sport on campus. And you're pretty much like you have an 88%, I think is the figure, chance of getting admitted, right? So that's kind of its own little loophole. But right now, we're talking about the personal score. So yeah, like I said, athletic rating of one, that's 88%. Personal rating of one, that's 66%. Academic rating of one, and again, this is for Harvard, 68%. I just find this stuff interesting, but we can share the slides on this if anyone has any interest in looking at this. Okay, we've gotten to the fun part. Let's talk essays. And of course, given kind of where we are with everything, I definitely wanted to take a moment and talk about the role of AI in essay writing. Specifically, like, listen, obviously, of course, every student I think has had their brush with AI, especially, when it comes to assignments in school. Um, Teachers have different kind of stances on this. One thing that I'm going to say is that, again, just note that the personal statement is called the personal statement for a reason. One fun fact is that some studies were conducted, and the tone of AI writing is that of like a middle-aged white man. And I'm going to guarantee to you all that all good, Elaine, that you do not have the tone of a middle-aged white man. So it's actually very easy to suss out if a student has used AI. And additionally, a personal statement has to come from stories about you. Even if you're feeding, like ChatGPT data, it's gonna read dry, it's gonna be devoid of personality, and I'll just show you an example. So I actually have, so one of these essays is from a real student, and one of them is not. It's the same topic. I fed some data in. I want everybody to take a look at it and just kind of see like what their overall takeaway is. So let's get started here. Everyone take a moment to read this. And you can just give me a thumbs up when you are ready to go to the next slide. Oh, fast. All right, love it. Honestly, good. That's kind of the rate at which admissions officers read these things. So good stuff. Keep in mind, this is not the full essay. I don't like sharing entire essays all the time. But this is kind of like, the beginning, like that hook, and then the takeaway. So we'll talk about the overall kind of impression that we've got. All right, we got one thumbs up, two thumbs up. All right, okay. So that is essay one. Let's look at just an excerpt from essay two. Cool. I don't think I even did the next. I don't think I gave them the, yeah. All right. So, quick guesses. Which one is AI? Which one's not? You can sound off in the chat. Sometimes it's harder to tell. But I feel like this is fairly easy to tell. Or are we not sure? Oh, interesting. Let me see. Some just wrote something. All right. We've got someone saying the first one is the first one AI or real? And I want to know why we think that. That's a great catch. That's funny. I did not even right. Second one's AI. Okay. So here's my takeaway. The first student, this first essay is a student that I worked with. Um I this student had a personality with like a capital P. I talk about him all the time. I think he's like one of the funniest people I've ever met. So I think it was important, when you meet with a student, I'm immediately kind of identifying like some personality traits that are very clear. He was such a jokester, and always was kind of like cracking some kind of joke when we were meeting. Sometimes he would be a little unserious generally, but that was kind of part of his like charm. And so when we were working together, I thought that, okay, let's infuse that. He really just knocked this paragraph out. And this was a couple years ago, so I know it wasn't AI, first of all. But he knocked a couple of paragraphs out. Honestly, I think in one night. And he just spoke genuinely from what the process is like of making this bed. Um, it's something that was a constant battle with his mom. And he definitely also could be stubborn. So, we frame that as well. And one thing I would say is these traits, aren't necessarily all, like the most positive, right? There's some level of vulnerability to this story, and a level of honesty that I think can take it out of that AI zone. Right? Whereas like this one, it's just I started falling asleep as I was reading it. Like even though it's sort of similar content, and hilarious that they said four words in five. But yeah, it just reads kind of devoid of personality. It just doesn't I don't know anything about this person. It's just like that's what any teen would say, right? Whereas here, like, we've got a sense of this student like having kind of a funny sense of humor. He is honest that he's like, I still don't like it, right? I still don't like making the bed. It's not fun for me. But I just do it anyway, right? Because it is the least I can do. It gives a sense of like his relationship with his mom as well, which was really, really like a big part of his life. So, this is kind of an example of like, okay, this is where you lose, where AI is a missed opportunity. All of that to say is also like these admissions officers all now have AI detectors, so just just don't do it, right? Just don't do it. You can run into like you can run the risk of having your application just thrown out if it like doesn't pass that detector. And all they want to know about is you. So it would be much more important and better to be imperfect and honest, right? And be a human being than like kind of take the easy way out and use AI. So this is something you'll all receive, and I want to kind of talk about in general like what the role of the personal statement is at this point before I get into the checklist. Now, like I said, the role of the personal statement is to be that one kind of by proxy representative of you, um, as if you are in the office with that admissions officer telling them a story about your life. So as with, the mattress topic, I thought was an important one because as I had alluded to previously, it has nothing to do with his high school performance, it has nothing to do with academics. It just has to do with him as a human being. Um, In general, these essays are typically about, there's some variants, but the personal statement that comes through the Common App is 650 words. Just think about how hard it would be to try to tackle a really big story, like all about all of your life, right, in 650 words. I don't think anyone existing on this earth can be contained in 650 words, right? So, one important thing to think about is, okay, personal statement. This is your opportunity to, one, isolate something that you have not told the admissions officers about yourself. That is much more like a soft factor, like a quirk even. Like I've had a lot of students write great essays about personal quirks that they have that like their friends make fun of them for. You just don't want to do the like, oh, my name is Kate Manier and I was born in 1990 and in this town, and you can't go through all of it, right? So, so being pretty focused, I think, is important, and it makes your job a lot easier. So think of being really in depth with your topic, being able to dive much deeper. If you spread yourself too thin with like trying to make connections between these rangy things, it's not going to hit well, right? So a deeper inquiry that is really, really impactful, that's going to be what you want to shoot for. Keep it on the personal side. Um, and we'll talk about kind of where you'll have opportunities to talk about your academic experience, and to talk about extracurriculars. In general, I recommend not here. One note that I will make is that I had mentioned students come to me and say, I don't have a story to tell or nothing's happened to me that's really interesting. Sometimes that's phrased very specifically, which is like, I don't have any trauma to write about. And so you'll see on, I'm sure if any of you are on TikTok, like looking at college admissions TikTok, um, students are kind of often posting like, oh, here's my story. There's like the I hate the letter S, and it's about like the student who lost a parent, right? And a student will then just kind of get in their heads that they need something like traumatic or terrible to have happened to them to have a good personal essay topic. And I strongly disagree with that. If nothing terrible has happened to you, that's great. That's great. And I think it's actually incredibly difficult to write about like anything that's like a medical trauma or a personal trauma or even like mental health stuff. It's really difficult to write about that in your personal statement. Remember, you have 650 words. And I also think it's important to note that like whatever that story is, you aren't that story. Like that's not what you want to centralize in the personal statement. There's a place to do that, and we'll talk about where that could be. Just some notes for the personal statement that are good kind of rules of thumb. So you're definitely gonna want to start with a hook. Um, in general, when like a hook, like the first line or so, is what you're gonna want to have as super strong. There are a couple of different approaches to this. You could start with like a really declarative, strong line that builds intrigue, right? I'm going to show you some examples in a sec. You could start with something that's kind of an oxymoron or contradictory. You would start with a funny, something funny, a joke. Like you just want something that, like, the feeling is, okay, well, I've read that line and now I want to know more. I want to keep reading. Additionally, your first paragraph, unlike other essays, you don't want to sum up the entire story in the first paragraph. This is much more of a creative writing task, right? So, what you're actually going to want to do is that first paragraph is just make them want to know more, leave it unresolved, like heighten that conflict in the first paragraph. And then as the essay goes on, you can kind of wrap it all up. Other rules of thumb, if you start in the past, you get to the present really quickly. I really actually like an origin story about like when a student's really young. I feel like it can get to like the core of who a student is. So like for example, if a student was like when they were like really young, they started just like collecting things relentlessly, and they've continued that. That's great. The key is just like get into the present really quickly. So make sure that, that's my origin story, but now I'm going to jump right to now. So like tiny anecdote is fine from you when you were really young, but you definitely don't want the whole story to be from like middle school or even early high school, I would say. Sort of similar principle here is if you're writing about other people, the proportion should be pretty weighted towards you still. So It can be about a relationship, like as with the mattress essay. This student, his mom was pretty heavily featured, but it really felt kind of, it was more about him and his own personal journey, like around her, although she influenced kind of his decision making, right? Um, so do you get to your life? Do you get to you really quickly? Make sure that proportion sticks. One story and not your entire life story. I've already touched on this one. New and personal about you that's not elsewhere in your application. I've also mentioned. One thing we haven't talked about yet is visual language. So as you're getting to the end of your, refinement process of your personal statement, you want to go through every sentence and say, okay, like, can I picture this? Can I feel this and see it? Do I feel like I'm in the room where the story's happening? Um, Show don't tell is like obviously like a very trite old adage, but it's incredibly important here. So think of like I think often having a list of kind of really good sense memory or sense visual imagery, sense imagery like words as you write, I think is helpful. Um, One thing that I also recommend is doing kind of like a blind peer swap where you and your friends all swap your essays. The goal is to make sure that your friends can pick your essay out as yours like right away. So does it read as individually you, right? And it couldn't be anyone else. That's incredibly important, right? Like I said about the mattress, the AI mattress story, that could have been any teen. Like, oh, I'll just be like sleeping in it. I remember myself saying that. So what are those things that you're going to implement that really set you apart and are unmistakably you, right? Um, Major obstacle, I kind of talked about this as well, but getting to the resolution is super important. No trauma dumping, right? Again, the personal score is often like, okay, is this person positive? Does this person kind of get to the good stuff, right? Like, is it reading too negative? It reading negative can impact your application. And is it written in your voice? Now, you all are juniors in high school, so you're not going to necessarily have like what I would call a writer's voice, but what I will say is the college essay and the personal statement, they're pretty conversational. So actually a really good hack that I like to use with a student who might be getting a little bit of writer's block, especially looking at, a blank page. Sometimes it's even better to just use a dictation tool. This is where AI is kind of helpful, right? Like, um, sit down with someone like in your life, your friend, your parents, like anybody who you trust and feel like you can comfortably tell the story that you're going to write about to, and just have this tool kind of take down the dictation. Um, Now that's got to be within reason, right? You don't want to use slang or anything offensive, but this writing can be pretty conversational, as you saw with our original students writing. So I'm going to do another example right now for us all to read through of a successful personal statement. I want to talk through what everyone kind of thinks about it when we're done. This is going to be a little bit longer than the other two. This is the full one because I just want to see everyone's opinions on it. But when we'll start reading, give me a thumbs up when you're ready to move on. We got some speed readers here. Okay. I love it. I love that we are zooming through this. All right, we got one more page of this. And sorry if it's cutting off a little bit, but you get the general gist. All right, thumbs up when we're done. I'd love to hear some overall impressions. One thing I like to ask, when I'm, talking to students and they're looking at a personal statement for the first time, what kind of, what are some personality traits we can pick out about this person from this essay? Like, what do we feel like we know about this person, even who he might be on campus? I can give you a little background on this kiddo too. This was a student from last year. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think all three are probably kind of nailed it. Artistic, thoughtful, insecure. I think this student, you'll laugh, but like you learn so much about a student when you work on these essays with them and the college list. And I think he was incredibly wary of like what the right choice was, what the right thing to say was. If my other kid that I was talking about that did the mattress story is like one side of the spectrum. This kid's on entirely the other. So really serious, like very, very serious. He like has a history club at his school. He's like all about, he really values, like he always talking about beauty, and the past, like he loves old films, kind of like a really old soul, actually, is sort of what I'd say. A really talented painter. I actually saw the painting. This is like the painting that he did. We submitted that alongside his application, which I think was a really good touch. Because it was like, yeah, no, this is real. And this really happened. Um, this kid definitely is like incredibly introspective, and I think what's important to note is Beatrice, I think all of your kind of notes on what your takeaways were about his personality, I think are correct. And I think it's important to mention that like even though we can say insecure, there's still development, right? To the point that at the end, we know he started that way, but we see him like fight his way through it, right? So it's really important. I mean, he absolutely initially was like, I don't know that I want to say that that was something I was afraid of. I don't know that it like looks good to people to talk about how I didn't want to look at myself in the mirror or like, having body confidence issues. Um, but within this context of painting, which is one of his bigger kind of hobbies, I think it actually worked out really well. It's this thing that kind of like it's a skill set he employed to work around a really big kind of personal obstacle that he had, an emotional obstacle. Um, and he continued his self-portrait project. As I said, he submitted those paintings. You kind of see his evolution as a person through that. So it's just a lovely story. And it's kind of like this type of student, he can't be writing that mattress story. Right? Like, it's important you lean into your very, very specific attributes. And so this is where like it's great that we have some families here, some parents here, um, because it can be hard for a student to really nail down like, oh, who am I, right? But having kind of like having someone that knows you really well read your work and be able to validate, yes, this is you, this is aligned with who you are, is really, really important. Like that has to be goal number one of the personal statement is does it read like real authentic to me? And could I have written in another way? Like once you start kind of trying to sound impressive or force yourself into a story that's like kind of artificial, that's when you run into some trouble. So I think in general, the rule of thumb with the personal statement is, um, you want it to read positive, but you also shouldn't you can't shy away from the vulnerability of, you know, of who who you are, right? It's okay if you talk about being insecure or being selfish at times as a kid. It's okay as long as you come out on the other end, like having learned, right? Having learned your lesson. Um, okay. Any questions about the personal statement? We'll talk a little bit more big picture now, just about what college admissions officers are going to see. So I mentioned that the personal statement is going to be the really big one, right? But there are some other components of an application that your admissions officers will view alongside the personal statement in the Common App, right? And these are all written, this is all written content. And therefore, for me, it goes under that personal score. Um, so it's something that you should be really strategic about thinking about, right? Sometimes a student will be like, I don't really know what to write about in the additional info session section. And that's okay, but typically there is some way to fill that space. Um, and I think I'll talk about one opportunity there, which I think is really important. But as I said, so basically college admissions officers will look at, they'll get your application, which is your Common App, right? That includes some biographical information. It includes your self-reported test scores if you have those. It includes your activities section, which we'll talk about in a sec, an additional information essay. They'll also see your grades, right? Your transcripts, which are sent separately, as well as your school profile, which shows like the amount of difficult courses that are available, and they kind of cross-reference, okay, how many rigorous courses has the student taken, versus are available, right? So that's kind of the full picture of what they're looking at. So they're seeing the rote data, the numbers, they're seeing your list of activities, they're seeing your additional info. So here's where there's opportunity, right? Because you can't influence data, you can't change your grades or scores. There's a strategy to how you write the activities section. Now, I don't know if anyone's looked into it yet or looked at the Common App. It's kind of a bummer, but the activities section is really pretty bare bones, actually. You're asked to list and rank your top 10 activities. They give you very specific entry fields, right? So how many hours per week, how many weeks per year do you do this? What grades did you do this in? So they'll ask about your hourly commitment, your position, and then you have about at least like 140 characters to describe your activity, which is kind of maddening because it's like, well, I did this like 20 hours a week or, 10, 15 hours a week for all 4 years, and I have to write about it in, you know, like a tweet. Like, well, tweets used to be limited. But that's really tough, right? And so this is where it's super important to be strategic about how you write about your activities, how you order them, and then how you're going to lean on the additional information section and supplemental essays to provide context, right? So one thing to think about is when it comes to activities, some are pretty self-explanatory. So sports, I think in general, your time commitment is going to be pretty heavy. Um, and there might not colleges here colleges see so many essays or have historically seen so many essays about sports injuries or writing about a sport because the student's like, well, that's my biggest activity. I need to write about it, right? Um, so they've seen every take. They've just seen every take on the sport, unless you have something really, really unique. So in general, I think yeah, keeping the sport in the activity section is a great idea. Keeping an activity that's really well known, like DECA or like Future Business Leaders of America, things that they understand what it is because they're admissions officers and know what the biggest activities are. For the most part, those are great in the activities section. You want to use really great active verbs there, right? And you want to quantify your achievements as well. So, like, if you led a club of 20 people, put that number in, right? It's not just like bet every week and did fundraising. No, it's I've raised X amount of funds by managing X amount of students and conducting quarterly fundraisers, right? So you want to just make sure it's a little more quantified. Um, in general, you will find when you list out the activity section that there will be a couple of activities that scream at you. They're like, this isn't coming across. Like that, it's not getting across like how involved I was in this. And that should be a real signal to you. Oh, I really have to write about this somewhere else, right? So if you did research, one great opportunity is that you could put your research abstract really bare bones and bullet points, right? Not an essay, but you could put your research abstract in the additional information section, right? That's definitely one thing you can do. I talked about how like the a trauma or like, a really extenuating life circumstance is really tough for a personal statement. It's really often like I think successfully leveraged in the additional information section because it's, something that probably did affect at some point grades. And if it didn't, then all the more important to say, hey, I went through this and I still have a 5.0, right? So, the other thing that's great about the additional info section is that they are not expecting the type of creativity that you had to write the personal statement with. They are expecting really dry and straightforward language. Bullet pointed is even better, right? Um, think again, like these admissions officers are reading dozens and dozens of applications, right, per day, sometimes hundreds, right? Um, they're overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed with information, and reading something that's like really laborious to read is not gonna serve you well. Like that doing that in the additional information section is not a good idea. It's kind of why the activities section is the way it is. It's just like fatigue, right? You can only read so much, you can only take in so much. They take notes on all of this, but in terms of just like digestibility should be top of mind when you're creating all of this content. I think as you saw, like it was pretty easy to blow through those essays that I showed you. And that's on purpose, right? Because it needs to be readable, it needs to be digestible. Um, and so remember, like additional info, you have 650 words there, but if you don't fill all that space. Do not. They tend to get fatigued, and sometimes just like natural bias and when people are looking for a reason to, select one student over another, sometimes those things can weigh in, as unfair as it is. Any questions just about kind of like the core of the application, the use of those sort of core materials? All right, let's talk about the fun stuff, which is essay supplements. So, I saw a figure pretty recently, that these days, this wasn't always the case. I remember writing a handful of essays, supplemental essays for my applications. I think I applied to University of Virginia and they asked about like, what's your favorite piece of art? And that wasn't just because I wanted to be an art major, that was for every student. And that could be a book or a piece of music or a piece of or a painting. But they did ask about that. I remember I wrote about Kandinsky. I don't know why, and I don't think it was very good. But there were really very few. Like that's why I remember it. I was like, oh, that's interesting and different. Now every college has essay supplements, basically, it feels like, especially on the more selective range. Quite a few have multiple. And so on average, a student's going to be doing probably 15 plus essays for their college applications. That can vary. Some schools really, sorry, go overboard and require seven. Looking at Wake Forest, which is very irritating, but it's a good way of kind of sussing out, is the student really interested, right? Are they going to come to this school? So that's some schools employ that as a way to like kind of confirm to protect their yield, right? Protect their enrollment. So if a student's going to put in the effort to write seven other essays, and they've applied early decision, sorry, and they've applied like regular decision, it's probably a safer projection that they might actually go, right? Because they put in that effort. Um, Now, this is where it gets kind of crazy and unwieldy because, like, you have the core of the application, which goes to every school. That you want to be really tight. You want to make sure all of your bases are super covered, in terms of like everything you want to get across, right? And you do, as you saw, have some opportunities to do that. But then we also have essay supplements, right? So, now our kind of like scope expands. Now we have more opportunity to share things about ourselves. So, what we tend to do here at Testive is we think about, okay, what are the most common essay supplements? I see them all every year. They tend to not change too often. Um, but they can. I mean, it sort of differs. I think after COVID, there were some changes, definitely. But it's good to just get a sense of like if you have a school that's your school, right, that's on your list now, just looking at what their current prompts are, it's worthwhile. It's like worth doing. Um, Likely any student who's applying to a good amount of schools that are in that, top 100, like super selective range, you're probably gonna have to write about the following four categories. So, you have the why major. So why do you want to study what you want to study? Why do you want to go to the school you want to go to? Expand on an activity, like your most significant activity, and describe a community that you're a part of. There are definitely some other ones that are more kind of like curveballs, that some schools provide. Like, I think Yale has one that's like a time that someone changed your mind. Stanford has one that's like write a letter to your roommate, which I think is a great one. I think it's very, again, gets that personal score, right? So, but I think in general, when you're starting to develop all your content, I'm going to take you through like sort of how to do that in a minute. When you are brain dumping everything that you have and that you want to write, you want to think about like, okay, which story goes best where? So knowing kind of the scope of the topics that you're going to be writing about is definitely something that you should be aware of, right? Because sometimes you can be like, I have a topic for my personal statement. It's about my activity and it's so good, but like I don't have much to say about other activities. Then you could have this great personal statement, but then if someone asks you about your most significant activity, then you're like, then you have to write sort of another one, like reinvent the wheel and do another one. So there's definitely a way to make this much more efficient. One thing to note is that essay supplements, thankfully, are not usually 650 words. They're usually shorter. Sometimes that's nice, and sometimes it's really annoying. Like when you have like a 100-word response. It's like, why? What are you doing? But schools do it, so you have to make sure you're kind of hitting the word limit. You're getting all of the kind of core and seed of what you want across. And sometimes the message has to be the same from like a 650-word essay to a 100-word essay. And an advisor can really help you sort of distill down to 100. Because I've been doing this for so long, I've just become incredibly effective at just cutting things down, which is really tedious. So it can be, uh, that's where like having a really, really useful, having someone who has some experience in that process is really important, right? Um, so essay supplements can be annoying because you think you kind of have everything across, but definitely what you want to do is streamline this process. Start with templatizing, right? Saying like, I know I'm going to write about this for my community essay, but then you also want to customize it right to each school. So there's a bit of like a balancing act to do. So that's where I think this process can be streamlined, but you still have to pay really special attention to each prompt. So I want to start with just kind of like what our essay generation topic looks like now that we have the general kind of scope of all of the essays that we have to do, right? So imagining maybe it's 15, maybe it's 20, it can be up to 50, honestly, with some students that I've worked with, which is wild. And then your eyes start to fall out of your head after a while. You're just like, I can't, like everything starts to look the same. But so super important here. We have an essay brainstorming intake that's multiple pages here at Testive. The most important thing that you want to do is like leave no stone unturned, right? So every possible thing that you think you might want to write about needs to go in this brainstorming intake. Even if you're like, I don't think so. I don't think that's a good idea. put it down, right? No idea is too stupid. No, like, attribute of yours is too small. The questions in our intake have word, not limits, they have like a requirement. So it's like you need to write 300 words on this topic. Um, the questions also touch on a community you're a part of, an activity that's important to you, those common supplemental essays. It asks about some more personal questions that students might not think to put down on the page initially. But it's really important to like invest at least 2 hours in like a really, really, really exhaustive brain dump. Um, so just making sure that like you have everything from your life that you can put down on the page, you put down on the page. That is when you typically come to an advisor or testive, right? I tend to give a student a week to do the brain dump, and I say, like, if you're not coming back to me unless you are over 300 words and you make all of the, you hit all of the questions, right? Because sometimes like a student just will not even think to include a detail that could be the essay. In the case of the mattress student, like the bed making student, we didn't get there till a couple of sessions, right? We kept talking and kept trying to figure out what's the topic. Nothing was just clicking, and then all of a sudden he sort of made an offhanded comment to me about that. And so then I kind of something clicked and we started talking about it, and then the free write really like flowed from there, honestly. Um, but the brain dump is going to be kind of your source of truth, like this brainstorming intake, where you'll be able to eventually, with the help of your advisor, isolate big application themes, right? It's probably around like we like to nail down like 5 to 10. So, okay, what are these 5 to 10 non-negotiable things that we want to get across to the admissions officer? Um, and like we want to have essentially that all free written out before we even start writing the essays. Eventually, some of that language can be used for the essays, but right now it's just like, okay, information on the page. You can kind of like word vomit it out. It doesn't have to be grammatically perfect. It's just got to be information, right? An advisor can't do anything with no content. They can do a lot with a lot of content. So that's the important thing. So isolating definitely like in order of preference things you want to get across to your admissions officer is incredibly important. Your advisor can also help you with that. Like you might say, "Oh, I want to write about that sports injury," and then your advisor might be like, "Sports injuries are pretty common." So like you're always kind of negotiating with your advisor about what are those kind of non-negotiable topics. Then you're going to gather your prompts. As we have done, we've kind of looked at, right, what our scope of prompts are. There might be some that you have to, like, that will come out in August when the supplemental prompts come out. Um, but at least with this, you have like a really great suite of essays that you're going to have to write, right? So then you're going to sort by topic, right? All of the YS essays, like all of the Y major, all activity, right? So we're sorting by topic. Then we are going to go back to our brain dump, our little source of truth, and start basically a sorting, right? Okay, my my advisor feels like there was like a really great story about the specific activity that I did, that I wrote right in my brain dump. And so like that's what we're going to use for the activity essay, right? Your advisor is going to be the one who's going to help you say, all right, like the personal statement, like your for instance, your like medical trauma, like maybe that doesn't go in the personal statement. That's additional information. But I remember this other story from when we did our brainstorming together that I think would be like a fabulous essay, right? And that's kind of how these topics are born and selected. Um, and this also ensures that you're not going to be repeating yourself, right? You're not going to write about the same thing in two essays because, again, you have to be super purposeful about making sure that every bit of space that we have, we're using to provide something new about you. Once we have kind of templates, which your advisor basically will help you create outlines for that, and kind of gather like prompts. Sometimes I will write out written prompts for the student to answer, and then we kind of start, putting together the essay with your writing that way. And then, that's when we start to bring in the hook for the personal statement and really like look at our checklist, make sure we have everything we want and need, and, that it satisfies everything we're trying to achieve. So once we get into kind of like drafting form, at that point at that point it's pretty easy, right? Because like you already have a ton of writing, you are clear on what your objective is with the essay, right? Um, and you are clear with what your theme is. So you're not discovering the theme as you write it. Like that's the last thing you want to do. The themes are already picked out. And then the final bit is tweaking back and forth with your advisor. Typically we trade, like every 2 days. And the advisor gives a lot of comments on, okay, like this sentence is a little bit vague. Like what's some descriptive imagery you could use to make me feel like I'm there, right? So just like elevating the content that you have, keeping that conversational voice, keeping that voice that is your voice, um, but just like finding ways to make it more engaging and vivid and authentic. So as I said, like some schools tend to value different things. So, like University of Michigan is an example, like they love someone who's like really involved in service. And so, for instance, maybe your Y essay template deviates a little bit from like what you had by adding some more components of that. So the tweaking can look a little bit more extensive than just like changing the name of definitely more extensive than changing the name of the school. Or like sometimes there will be a same kind of core story or part about you. But there's definitely some customization going on as we're tweaking these questions. Okay. So I just want to show you an example of how annoying this process can get. Um, but I think this shows, I think, the importance of streamlining, right? And working with someone who kind of knows what they're doing and like how to not fall into the trap of reinventing the wheel and writing a brand new essay every single time. Because that again can just eat up hours and hours of your life per week, right? And you should be focusing on school, which is most important. So I'm going to give you an example of a couple of a couple of prompts for like more popular schools, and show you how we're sorting these prompts into the same category. Now, you'll notice what is tough about these is that they're just close enough together topically that it makes sense to kind of approach them all at once, but they're also different enough too, right? That you start to like it all starts to kind of blur together and then it just can get really um it can get pretty dizzying by the end. But again, this is where I think it's really important to remember, okay, academic interest and why major. Sure, you want to obviously look at the prompt, but always, always, always the very first thought needs to be, what story am I telling about myself? Right? Okay, why major? You do not want to spend for any of these 300 to 500 words, 200, 250 words, um, 300 words. If you're spending like 50 words talking about yourself and 250 words talking about the opportunity at the school, that's not right. That's not the right proportion. These schools know about themselves. They know what their programs are, right? So again, it's got to be like, as unlike in any other part of life, your main mission in writing these essays is to make it about you. Even if they're writing, like asking you to write about something else. So most students choose their intended major based on a passion or inspiration. What led you to choose this area of study? So why do you want to study what you want to study? That's 300 words, pretty straightforward. Um, every student tends to have like kind of an origin story about what they want to study and what they like, why they care about it. Sometimes that does have a personal genesis. Sometimes it doesn't. And we'll show you an example in a sec. But then we've got some variants here, right? Like Brown specifically refers to their open curriculum, which is a little bit different. And they ask, how are you going to pursue it at Brown, right? So there's a level of reading these prompts that is important, right? You might still start with that kind of core origin story, but then you have to really then go do some research on Brown, right? And you have to do that within 200, 250 words. So there are all these kind of pieces you have to sort of cobble together, which can be a little bit tough. Um, and finally, we have Wisconsin-Madison, which 650 words, oof. And they have like they're like why Wisconsin-Madison and also why major, and sometimes those two can often those two overlap, right? Like obviously the school having a great major in the area that you want to study is probably going to be one of the number one reasons why you want to apply there. But not every school asks about that. Some split them up, right? So some will just say why major, and then they'll have a separate essay that's like why schools. Some put them together. Um, so here you have actually a lot of word space. So it's really important to just think about, again, what's the story I'm telling about myself? What's like the kind of angle on like what I want to study, and how does that differentiate me from the other majors that are other people that are applying for that major, right? And then yeah, you got to do a little bit of research on the school. We'll talk a little bit about what that should look like too in a bit. So then you're ending up with like three different topic, three kind of sort of similar but different enough, right? Essays, all different lengths. And so, you end up basically what you do with an advisor is you're going to draft a longer kind of like template essay that is just gets at, okay, why I want to study what I want to study, right? That's it. That's your first assignment here. Write longer, overwrite, right? You want to write like pretty much double ultimately what you end up submitting, at least, because a lot of we're mining for gold here, so like you're trim a lot of fat. Um, but starting there, then you've got to basically then what you do is with the help of an advisor, then you're like, okay, the next longest one is 300 words. We're going to cut it down together and make sure that we still like retain the important information, keep the singularity, but now it's 300 words. And then we go down to the 200, but we're supplementing, right? So that's kind of how the process starts to go. But luckily, like if you can make that sort of origin story about you and why major super, super strong, then you're not starting over from square one, right? And typically, like the research that you can find about a lot of these schools, you're still coming from you, right? So there might be an activity you haven't written about yet that you want to expand on a tiny bit. You'll always find something at these schools that is a fit for that, right? Um, so it's not just like you're randomly finding things you like. There's still a strategy also to like what specific research you conjure up about the school and the major. Here's another example of how like community essays can tend to vary. Oh, Michigan, I think is 500 words. Rice is 500 words. So often community questions are kind of a two-parter. So it's like describe the community you're a part of and how your place within it, right? Sometimes it's like describe a community you're a part of or what perspective you bring, right? That's kind of a way to like talk about community. How are you going to bring diversity to our campus is another common question. One thing to note here is that these questions are purposefully really open-ended. Community does not just mean like your, racial identity or like ideology or it could be anything, right? It could be like a club that you're in. So again, you have to start from you. It's not really wise to be like, okay, let me think about like my religion and what would I write about that? By the time we're here, we already have a sense of what we're gonna write for like a community essay, right? And then we're just sort of tweaking and making sure we answer all the prompts. We're making a value fit, right? Like an argument for value fit as we do this. Rice is a tough one. Rice has tough essays. But yeah, I think what's nice about Rice is they're pretty like individual and different. Their residential college system is pretty different. Everyone wants to write about that, right? So again, some of these things like you just start to learn as you go through the process that as long as I show that I've done really good research about the school, that's not just like, oh, Rice has 8,000 people undergrad, like anything that's like really Googleable. you showed that you looked into the like looked through syllabi, like found a really specific component of research or someone's research who aligns with your own. Like as long as you can do that, you've done your job research wise. Your goal is what am I getting across about me? And then we have why us. Ooh, Dartmouth, 100 words or fewer. How are you going to find something like super specific in 100 words or fewer? Not really. So kind of what's the angle here, right? Like I think it's important to, again, start with yourself and just make that argument for value fit. So it's not really necessarily about it could be one specific program, but you could also make the kind of, oh, this is the school's mission, or this was my like specific experience with Dartmouth, like, their value of a liberal arts education, like is increasingly kind of standing out a little bit more these days. So like what's your experience with that? There are connections you can make. But again, like this is where you probably have to kind of start from scratch for a lot of them. Um, but again, it starts to become a place of like, okay, well, we haven't written about, we haven't been able to like write about our community that we're a part of for Carnegie Mellon, but we could do that in the YSA, right? So it's kind of like fitting everything in like a neat little puzzle, which can start to be very satisfying. Um, so a couple of why essay tips. I've said enough, make it about you. Be super specific with your research. In general, what I will say is the like first five or so bits of research or reasons that a student comes to me with tend to go by the wayside because everyone thinks the same thing, and that's not to say that that's not a valid reason. Often it is, but it just doesn't have a place in the why essay. Like, oh, I walked on campus and felt right at home. That's a real thing, but just you don't need to write it. It just they're like admissions officers' eyes kind of glaze over at that stuff. So, sort of getting that stuff out and then being more granular with your reasoning is super important. No citation of prestige, ranking, or location. Again, like I said, like anyone who applies to a New York school, like I know you're gonna have to write about New York City, so you can do it, but it's not going in the essay. Just get it out of your system. If you're citing a student order class, you want to make sure it's not, a really common one that's offered like Habitat for Humanity, unless there's something really special about that chapter, right? So just make sure that, you can't like it's really important with the research that you're doing to even try at the end. I'll often do this exercise with students. Okay, you've written this Y essay for Dartmouth. Let's just put Michigan's name there instead. Would it still work? Like, could it still be true? Sometimes it can, so you want to kind of watch out for that stuff, right? Like interdisciplinary, there are some buzzwords that just are said so much, even though they are true, that it just reads kind of cliche and throwaway. So like that's where the expertise of the advisor is really helpful. It's great to want a interdisciplinary education, but I've read so many essays about interdisciplinary education, and also all colleges talk about it. It's like a marketing, it's just like such a marketing buzzword. So you want to go beyond that, right? Try to make a values connection. What's a shared value you have with the school? That can be in their mission, that can be in like even, their commitment to supporting like students who need accommodations, even like there are all these things that you can kind of connect and make an argument for fit. Um, and then brain dump your reasons, all of them, pick the one or two that is most strongly connected to you, or that might uncover like a story that you haven't been able to tell yet that's really compelling. Okay, just because you gotta see it to get it. I have an example of a successful YS. Here. This student got into BU last year. Really, really tough. Like this student, I mean, where he was coming from is especially competitive for BU. So, I thought this was a really successful YSA. Everyone take a second to read through it, and we'll talk about what we liked. As we're finishing reading, would love to hear what our thoughts are, what we liked about this. Give a thumbs up when you're done. All right. What do we think? What were our takeaways? I mean, I think one thing that do we get a good sense of like this student through this essay, do we feel? Um, does it achieve the goal of talking more about the student than about BU? I think it does. One thing that he started and he really felt like he did a pre-summer program at BU and he loved it. He had such a good time. And I was like, that's so nice. And he definitely did the first draft, definitely like, oh, I set foot on campus. We were all like, we just all, it was so many diverse people. I learned about so many different things. It was such a great experience. It was wonderful. And I had to just have this moment with him where I was like, what person would not have a wonderful time at a BU pre-college program? I think that, a pre-college program is designed to be really wonderful. Um, and so in general, I just didn't feel that like said anything about him. So we had again done a bunch of free writing. I remember he had written about like these weak ties, or versus strong ties. It has to do with sort of educational develop like it has to do with development and human development, educational development. And it was an interesting like concept, right? Weak ties, strong ties, and how like this weak ties are the things that actually can help you with social mobility. You might not know that, but it's the truth. And so he was still able to talk about his pre-college program, but like he talked about it through a very, very specific angle that had to do with a research project that he was doing. So that is way, 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 right? Like he still was able to get that in, but I just had to push. You gotta like push yourself kind of beyond, like far beyond the general, right? And really dig a little bit deeper for these for them to stand out. But yeah, I think he did a good job of kind of like providing a new dimension to this like to his studies and to his research. He hadn't written about the research project anywhere else, so we thought it was a good opportunity. I think this is like one of the better Y essays. You get pretty used to seeing a very similar type of Y essay over the years, but this one was different, and I think really helped his application. Okay, we have an activities essay here. These are pretty straightforward. The variance tends to be honestly just around like length, right? So like what's an activity you like? That's a little bit less a little bit less windy, right? So or inconvoluted than like a Y major, YS, three different things. So these are pretty straightforward. I think I have an example here of some. Um, but these are always, I think, again, like what you want to do is make sure that you're not just giving a survey of the activity. Providing a good story is super important. So one example of a student that I loved was she found herself in this like research group where she was actually with professionals. So like she's like, I'm with a PhD from like Pittsburgh University. I'm with like a professor from like a chemist from China. She's like, I'm 17 and I don't know how to use a pipette. um, and so like it goes through the process of how initially she kind of like tried to act like she knew what was going on. Um, but then ultimately, like throughout the process, started just became so frustrated, honestly, that she totally went the other way and ended up just really relishing and asking all of the questions and like soaking up the information from those folks. And it ended in like an amazing actual like she had did her own research paper from that. We put the abstract in her additional information essay. So this is something where also like if you have an activity you want to write about, you don't want to survey the activity, you want to tell a specific story from it. But then again, that additional information section, you could put your research abstract in there, right? Think about how all these things talk to each other. That's incredibly important, and you can tell when someone does not think about it. Okay, we're almost there. I'm just going through a quick case study. Here's a little snippet of our essay questionnaire. So you'll see here academic intellectual interest, particular courses, 300 words minimum. I often tell students like overwrite, right? 300 plus, multiple pages of this. So this is something that I'm going to send to all of you, and you all, I know I've reached out to all of you about this, but as a free offer, like sit down, fill this out, and then do a 30-minute meeting with me. I can start kind of sussing out which topics work and which don't. And then we can even offer you working with an advisor to map out all the topics and help you execute. So I'll take you through a sample student I worked with last year. Um, Remy, Remy, great kid. So, he's a French student, so like his kind of big things, he's a big debater. Like that was his biggest activity. Um, Excellent grades. Test scores were just okay. I mean, he's in a baccalaureate program, so it kind of made sense. Shooting for Georgetown. Georgetown was a reach. We ended up, I think he applied to American as well. So he didn't know too much. We did our brainstorming intake, and I'm going to show you kind of how I teased down some themes here. His PS, and I'll show you an excerpt in a sec, but he wrote about he sort of like fell into the presidency of the Student Wellbeing Center, which is a really, really big, it's like one of the biggest leadership positions at his school and a huge time commitment, like a really big deal. He had been vice president and the president stepped down. He acknowledges, I think, even in the essay, that he did not want the job. He was like, that's too much work and I have other stuff going on. Like that's not really what I want to do. But once he got the mantle of this position, he decided he wanted to really nail it. But he ends up running into some issues. So that's what his PS is about. Well, I'll show you in kind of how we got there in a sec. So he's filled out everything, he's filled out this kind of this intake, like I said, like this is one of the example questions, and this was his real answer. So he said, "It's hard for me to accept that I can be wrong. This used to be especially true. Like I always was super convinced, I'd never doubt it. I always thought the other person was wrong. Diversity has helped solve this problem through multiple angles, from thought to culture, with different perspectives." He did a lot of things like cultural exchanges. He would do kind of weekly discussions at a local church that would like recruit people from different areas of the town to talk. And there wasn't like a ton of there actually, but this is something like he was always someone who was really interested in discourse, and like an exchange of ideas. But he definitely is that he was like, okay, I was like, that's interesting. That's a very decisive comment about yourself. And I was kind of like, well, I wonder if that's connected at all to the fact that you've been doing debate, right? Like, if you're a debater, you have to be pretty decisive, and you have to like have conviction in what you're saying to be convincing. And he's like, yeah, that's where it came from. Like, I have to be convincing, and so part of a way of being convincing is really believing in yourself and what you're saying. Other things about him, like highly, highly curious person, incredibly like inquisitive, loves public speaking. He talks about being a people person. So you'll see, like this kind of writing is not, he's just brain dumping, right? And that's what you want to see. I love this. So many things interest me, and even things that aren't related to what I'm interested in now, such as aviation. He took his own aviation and aeronautics class that was offered through his school, and like learned how to kind of fly a plane through a simulator. I was like, that's so cool. So yeah, he is a very curious kid. So I'm thinking about like application themes here. And I'm sorry, I know we're going over. I warned you, but we'll send a recording. Um, but I'm kind of seeing, okay, so we've got this kid who loves like debating, exchange of ideas. he can be pretty confident and like decisive when he's sharing his own thoughts and ideas. Also incredibly curious, like a very, very inquisitive person. Intellectual curiosity always stands out really nicely to, admissions officers. So let me take you to his personal statement excerpts. So what ended up happening with his kind of role, and the organization is called the House, quote unquote. Um, he decided that he was going to essentially overhaul the House. He's like, well, I'm a leader, and I think what a leader does is like have conviction and make decisions and make things happen and like get things going, right? Now he basically realized as he did like a free write, I gave him some prompts, some targeted prompts as we discussed this, but he at some point, the committee kind of came to him and they were like, "You're doing too much. You're just doing too much." And I'm like, "Well, why do you think you convinced, how did you get anything done before?" He described some of the things that he had planned, and it really did sound like overkill. And so like when we were talking, it just felt like I was like, okay, so I wonder if you sort of kind of, because you just have this natural inclination to be a leader with your ideas and be decisive and like, be convincing in a debate, like I wonder if you just kind of like lost the forest for the trees and just thought like, okay, as long as I can convince them, that I'm being a good leader. What he misses is that he sort of convinced them. Like he says, I won the argument, but I mistook the board's resigned acceptance for true agreement, right? So this is basically like him slowly realizing that his approach to debate works in that world, right? But there's also a lot of like opportunity for being more interrogative and, like being more inquisitive about what other people want. So he kind of lands on, he's like, now everything that I do, I come from a place of curiosity with like the people that are in this group. Um, I am not like my objective is not to convince them. It is to understand their perspective and what they want, and no decision that I make is solidified until I get like the approval of everybody in that group and all of their questions are answered and we all feel good about it. So he really like kind of turned around his entire approach. It's a moment again of vulnerability where he's like, "Oh, I screwed that up. Like I didn't nail that." But like there is this moment of reflection and changing, that I think lands really well. He even broadens the scope at the end by talking about how like this has even helped him in debate, and in discourse, right? Like he's just learned to come from a much more inquisitive place, and that has helped him anticipate counter arguments often. So, it broadened the scope of it as well. So the one thing we hadn't quite gotten to yet was this kind of like theme of inquisitiveness, curiosity. And so one thing that, we felt was an opportunity is that as a pure hobby, he like follows the stock market totally independently, no formal activity at all. So I think it might have been on his activity section, but like it was probably like, seventh out of 10. And there's no formal, he's not going to meetings, right? So we're like, okay, well, why don't we talk about this and like the genesis of this? Um, he had this kind of great interesting idea where about I think, the catch-22 politics and economics. And what I like is, this kind of interpolation on a combination of two fields rather than just like talking about one. And obviously economics and politics, they work together. Um, they go hand in hand, but like he he has a clear demonstrated interest and experience here that is really all from his own curiosity. So it felt important for us to get that across as well. Um, so yeah, I thought that I think he did a great job on this, and in general, like we're always thinking back to, okay, like if we're looking at all of this together, am I seeing Remy? Am I seeing Remy? And like the parents are part of that discussion. Remy's a part of that discussion. It's important that you like really not like needling word choice or vocab, but just kind of like overall, not to use a word that I kind of bashed before, holistically, does this feel like this? Okay, I'm gonna go over this. I'm gonna skip this case study because we've done quite a few examples here. But this was an example of some students who um these were like really impressive pre-med kiddos. The they're twins. And so like the Mina wrote about ASL, which was great. I think a lot of like service was demonstrated there. And then Dave actually wrote about his volunteer work at a nursing home. It was actually a very funny essay. So it provided this like great kind of more humorous dimension to an otherwise pretty serious and credentialed application. They got into 9 out of 9 schools, or 9 out of 10, I'm sorry, and really great ones. So they are doing well. They're in their DO program now. So it seems like that worked quite well. Okay, so we do have a general kind of proposed plan for timeline. I'll go over this quickly. Um, but June, the work of June, I would recommend essentially refining your list, right? You don't have to finalize it, but know what you're looking at so you have a sense of topics you're going to be working on. Start brainstorming for your personal statement in June. Drafting in July, like 3 to 5 hours a week, working on that. Starting to think about supplemental essay topics, right? And kind of drafting out those stories, right? That will be important. Think about scholarship opportunities. Some deadlines are a little bit earlier. Um, Start doing like a dump of all of your resume, of all of your activities. We also have a resume builder here that we use to help a student kind of inventory everything. Um, Listen, perfect world, you're polishing and finalizing everything in August. Things happen, but if you have kind of that core suite of material where it's like the Common App, additional information, essay, and a couple of supplemental essay topics where you have a lot of writing from that brain dump, and you've been working on that through, from June to July or so, you're in a really good spot. You're probably better off than a lot of students end up being. Um, Again, Perfect World September submission, but again, submissions are in early decision schools are in November 1st. Some are earlier if you're looking for scholarships, so just be conscious of that. But it's good in general, like if you work with an advisor, you will project out your own kind of customized timeline of when you want to submit everything. Okay, I know we went over a little bit. I want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, but I mostly just want to thank everyone for getting through with me. I know it's 8:45, we're 15 over, but I do want to leave space for questions. If you don't have any questions, thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time. I hope this was helpful. Keep an eye out as well because we have a special offer that will go out to you via email alongside a free resource, which is our brainstorming intake. So we're offering a 2-hour essay booster, which is incredibly useful. This is where essentially you document that source of truth. Thank you guys so much. You're gonna get if you use this booster, you get a brain dump, like you get that intake form, and then you will work with an advisor to draft out all of your topics and strategize about what goes best where. That positions you in a really great spot to really complete that essay, and also have an idea of what your topics are, right? So I'm going to put my Calendly link here if anyone is interested in I'm gonna stop sharing the screen.